a single soldier on his horse during a cavalry patrol in World War I. At the start of the war, every major army had a substantial cavalry, and they performed well at first. However, the development of barbed wire, machine guns and trench warfare soon made attacks from horseback far more costly and ineffective on the Western Front. Cavalry units did prove useful throughout the war in other theaters though, including the Eastern Front and the Middle East. The extent of the logistical apparatus that made the war feasible is almost impossible to imagine today. Hundreds of tons of armaments remain to be discovered under the former battlefields of Belgium and France. Gas attack on the West Front, near Saint-Quentin 1918, a German messenger dog loosed by his handler. Dogs were used throughout the war as sentries, scouts, rescuers, messengers, and more. The numbers and weights involved are vast. During the Battle of Verdun, for example, some 32 million shells were fired, while the British barrage preceding the Battle of the Somme fired some 15 million shells. In total, nearly 250 million shells were used by the British Army and Navy during the war. German soldiers posed near a horse mounted with a purpose-built frame, used to accommodate a captured Russian Maxim M1910 machine gun complete with its wheeled mount and ammunition box. Gas attack on the West Front, near Saint-Quentin 1918, a German messenger dog loosed by his handler. Bandages retrieved from the kit of a British dog, circa 1915. Dogs were used throughout the war as sentries, scouts, rescuers, messengers, and more. Railways, trucks and ships transported these munitions for much of their journey, but they also relied on hundreds of thousands of horses, donkeys, oxen and even camels or dogs for their transport. A pigeon with a small camera attached. The trained birds were used experimentally by German citizen Julius Neubrunner before and during the war years, capturing aerial images when a timer mechanism clicked the shutter. Field guns were pulled into position by teams of 6 to 12 horses, and the dead and wounded carted away in horse-drawn ambulances. The millions of men at the front and behind the lines also had to be fed and supplied with equipment, much of which was again hauled by four-legged beasts of burden. Unloading a mule in Alexandria, Egypt, in 1915. The escalating warfare drove Britain and France to import horses and mules from overseas by the hundreds of thousands. Vulnerable transport ships were frequent targets of the German Navy, sending thousands of animals to the bottom of the sea. Because of the deep mud and craters at the front, much of this could only be carried by mules or horses. Even the British Army, which could boast that it was the most mechanized of the belligerent forces, relied largely on horsepower for its transport, much of it organized by the Army Service Corps. By November 1918, the British Army had almost 500,000 horses, which helped to distribute 34,000 tons of meat and 45,000 tons of bread each month. Sergeant Stubby was the most decorated war dog of World War I and the only dog to be promoted to sergeant through combat. The Boston Bull Terrier started out as the mascot of the 102nd Infantry, 26th Yankee Division, and ended up becoming a full-fledged combat dog. Brought up to the front lines, he was injured in a gas attack early on, which gave him a sensitivity to gas that later allowed him to warn his soldiers of incoming gas attacks by running and barking. He helped find wounded soldiers, even captured a German spy who was trying to map Allied trenches. Stubby was the first dog ever given rank in the United States Armed Forces and was highly decorated for his participation in 17 engagements and being wounded twice. German soldiers posed near a horse mounted with a purpose-built frame, used to accommodate a captured Russian Maxim M1910 machine gun complete with its wheeled mount and ammunition box. The animals themselves needed feeding and watering, and British horses had to carry some 16,000 tons of forage each month. Members of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment rest their horses by the side of the road in France. In total, perhaps 6 million horses were engaged by all sides. Looking after these animals were specially trained soldiers who knew how to care for such beasts from their jobs before the war, and who were also trained in modern methods of animal husbandry, although the level of training varied from army to army. At Kemmel, West Flanders, Belgium. The effect of enemy artillery fire upon German ambulances in May of 1918. Without the millions of horses, mules and donkeys serving on the various fronts, the war of attrition would have been impossible. Losses through exhaustion, disease, such as infection from the tsetse fly in East Africa, starvation and enemy action were high. Red Crescent Hospital at Hafer Oja, 1916. 120,000 horses were treated in British veterinary hospitals in 1 year, many of which were field hospitals. The resupply of horses and other animals was a major concern for the leadership of all sides. A corporal, probably on the staff of the 2nd Australian General Hospital, holds a koala, a pet or mascot in Cairo, in 1915. At the outbreak of the war, Britain's horse population stood at under 25,000, and so it turned to the United States, which supplied around 1 million horses during the war. Canada and Argentina. Germany had prepared for war with an extensive breeding and registration program, and at the start of the war, had a ratio of 1 horse to every 3 men. Turkish cavalry exercises on the Saloniki front, Turkey, March of 1917. However, while the Allies could import horses from America, the Central Powers could only replace their losses by conquest and requisitioned many thousands from Belgium, from invaded French territory, and from the Ukraine. The difficulty of replacing horses arguably contributed to the eventual defeat of the Central Powers. A messenger dog with a spool attached to a harness for laying out new electric line in September of 1917. Despite the machine gun, barbed wire and trenches, or thick bushes in the Levant, cavalry proved to be remarkably effective during the conflict. Where mobile fighting could take place, cavalry saw considerable action at Mons, and Russian cavalry penetrated deep into Germany during the early phases of the war. An Indian elephant, from the Hamburg Zoo, used by Germans in Valenciennes, France to help move tree trunks in 1915. As the war dragged on, beasts of burden became scarce in Germany, and some circus and zoo animals were requisitioned for army use. Cavalry were still occasionally used in their traditional role as shock troops. Even later in the war, cavalry were effective in Palestine, although were obstructed by thick bushes as much as by barbed wire. German officers in an automobile on the road with a convoy of wagons. Soldiers walk alongside the road. Cavalrymen from Britain and her colonies were trained to fight both on foot and mounted, which perhaps accounts for horses' more frequent use by these armies than by other European forces during the conflict. But most military tacticians had already recognized that the importance of mounted soldiers had waned in the age of mechanized war, a shift that had already become apparent in the American Civil War. These homing pigeons are doing much to save the lives of our boys in France. They act as efficient messengers and dispatch bearers, not only from division to division and from the trenches to the rear, but also are used by our aviators to report back the results of their observation. Where cavalry regiments were maintained on the Western Front, Many considered them a drain on men and resources, and futile in the face of machine guns. This was despite the esteem in which such regiments were still held in the traditional military mind and the public popularity of the image of the dashing cavalryman. Belgian Army Pigeons. Homing pigeon stations were set up behind the front lines, the pigeons themselves sent forward to return later with messages tied to their legs. As well as acting as beasts of burden or participants in the fighting, animals also played a vital role in communication. Trained dogs were used to carry messages from the front lines, especially by the German forces, and both sides made particularly heavy use of pigeons. Two soldiers with motorbikes, each with a wicker basket strapped to his back. A third man is putting a pigeon in one of the baskets. In the background there are two mobile pigeon lofts and a number of tents. The soldier in the middle has the grenade badge of the Royal Engineers over the chevrons, which show he is a sergeant. Trained birds, which could fly at 40 kph or faster, relayed messages back from the front lines to headquarters, often more reliably or securely than telecommunications or radio. Naval ships, submarines and military aeroplanes routinely carried several pigeons to deploy in case of sinking or a crash landing. A message is attached to a carrier pigeon by British troops on the Western Front, 1917. One of France's homing pigeons, named Cher Ami, was awarded the French Croix de Guerre with Palm for heroic service delivering 12 important messages during the Battle of Verdun. Mobile homing pigeon units acted as communication hubs, and in Britain pigeon fanciers assisted in breeding and training for the war effort. The French deployed some 72 pigeon lofts. A draft horse hitched to a post, its partner just killed by shrapnel, 1916. Pigeons also captured the popular imagination, with one American bird, Cher Ami, awarded a French medal for her service within the American sector near the town of Verdun. On her last mission she successfully carried her message, despite being shot through the chest, and purportedly saved the lives of 194 American soldiers with her news. The feline mascot of the light cruiser HMAS Encounter, peering from the muzzle of a 6-inch gun. Animals also served important psychological functions during war. The military had long had a close association with animals, either as symbols of courage, such as lions, or through the image of the warrior and his horse. General Kaimyo, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Army at the formal entry of Tsingtao, December 1914. The use of horses was vital to armies around the world during World War I. Similarly, the enemy could be depicted as an enraged beast, as Allied propaganda presented the German war machine. The Central Powers reveled in depicting the British Empire as a duplicitous, colonizing octopus, an image that was in turn used against them by the French. Belgian refugees leaving Brussels, their belongings in a wagon pulled by a dog, 1914. Regiments and other military groups often used animals as their symbol, emphasizing ferocity and bravery, and also adopted mascots, both as a means of helping to forge comradeship and to keep up morale. A Canadian battalion even brought a black bear with them to Europe, which was given to London Zoo, where the creature inspired the fictional character of Winnie the Pooh. Australian Camel Corps going into action at Sharia near Beersheba in December of 1917. The colonel and many of these men were killed an hour or so afterward. There are many stories of the close relationship between men and their animals, whether bringing a reminder of a more peaceful life at home on the farm, or as a source of companionship in the face of the inhumanity of man. It is claimed that communications dogs were of little use among British soldiers, as they were petted too much and given too many rations from men in the trenches. A Soldier and His Horse in Gas Masks, circa 1918. Close proximity also brought dangers to men at the front. Manure brought disease, as did the rotting bodies of dead horses and mules that could not be removed from the mud or no man's land. German Red Cross dogs head to the front. Animals at home also suffered. Many in Britain were killed in an invasion scare, and food shortages elsewhere led to starvation and death. An episode in Wallachia, Romania. Lack of horses and other beasts of burden sometimes led to the ingenious use of circus or zoo animals, such as Lizzie the elephant, who did war service for the factories of Sheffield. In total, the World War I, in which 10 million soldiers died, also resulted in the deaths of 8 million military horses. Belgian chasseurs passed through the town of Daines, Belgium, on the way from Ghent to meet the German invasion. Photo credit: Library of Congress, Bundesarchiv, Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Text: Matthew Shaw.